You're listening to America's Most Challenging Issue, where BahaiTeachings.org interviews community builders across the nation who are inspired by the Baha'i vision of the oneness of humankind. Join us as we explore their work, bringing about racial unity and establishing a more just and equitable society. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. It has been said that all rivers and streams assume their meandering paths, but eventually they empty into one source, one unifying pool of mutuality. Baha'u'llah, the prophet and founder of the Baha'i faith, quote, taught the oneness of humanity. That is to say, all the children of men are under the mercy of the great God. They are the sons of one God. They are trained by God. He has placed the crown of humanity on the head of every one of the servants of God. Therefore, all nations and peoples must consider themselves brethren. They are all descendants from Adam. They are the branches, the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits of one tree. They are pearls from one shell. My guest today is Jack Gordon, an award-winning filmmaker, coalition builder, and world traveler who expends his creative energy for the promulgation of the principle of the oneness of humanity, the central belief of the Baha'i faith. As the on-air host of Interfaithish, a bi-weekly podcast that features engaging conversations about faith and belief, Jack invites members of various religious communities to discuss the similarities and differences of their respective traditions. The frank and honest exchanges tinged with humor and empathy stand in stark contrast to the contentious divisiveness which characterizes much of our public discourse. In his role as a documentary filmmaker and co-founder of Digital Development Communications, a production company founded in Madagascar, an island nation in Eastern Africa, Jack has produced and managed a number of engaging films that highlight the innovative methods employed by communities in response to persistent challenges. In this episode of America's Most Challenging Issue, I sit down with Jack Gordon to discuss his work, the passion that feeds it, and the beliefs that inform his choices to work in spaces of intersectionality and diversity. Jack Gordon, welcome to America's Most Challenging Issue.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. And it's so beautiful to hear your rich, beautiful voice in my ear.
Well, man, it's so good to have you here. And let's jump right in. Okay, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, the first question I want to talk to you about, as I was researching your work, I was struck by your willingness to move in places where you're often the minority, right? A social, circumstance which is often quite unfamiliar to many white Americans. And yet, as your own work in countries within Africa, Latin America, and Asia demonstrates, you've consciously chosen to be in spaces where you are the outlier. So I'm wondering, why this work? Why you? And why now?
Well, look, I do want to just own the fact that, as a white American traveling abroad, even if you are the minority in those places, you've got a leg up. There's spaces that I've been able to move into that I really have absolutely no business being in, just by virtue of the privileges that I'm afforded to and the opportunity to travel and so forth. So, I feel like it's important to own that. But, I will also say that, I think, staying in the same place is boring, just staying around with the things that or I mean, in my case, I'll just make it personal. I've never really wanted to stay just in the same place with just my own people. I've always had an interest in that, in moving around. And I think that was something that was instilled in me as a kid, really. I grew up in a household where, we had people from different countries living with us for extended periods of time, that different languages are spoken in our household. And that was just part and parcel of what our family was about, and felt very natural to me. The idea of going abroad, of being in new spaces, of asking questions and being curious about other people, even if it's in a language that I don't speak natively. That's something that comes fairly easily to me, and I'm grateful for that.
Now, in your other role as a podcast host, you facilitate the creation of a place of dialogue and understanding where diverse communities of faith can explore points of intersectionality and points of divergence, in an environment of mutual respect and empathy, right? It's often been said that Sunday is the most segregated day in America. And in contrast to this, we know that religious groups have often worked together historically to accomplish tremendous things. And I'm thinking in particular of relationships like those characterized by the great Jewish theologian Rabbi Abraham Heschel's ecumenical work with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But yet far too often, faith has become a battleground for power and control. According to the Baha'i faith, the disunity that exists between religious traditions is rooted in the blind imitation of the past. The Baha'i teachings revolve around the reality of the oneness, right? That anything that undermines our shared humanity must be discarded. And Baha'u'llah himself has said that if religion becomes a cause of disunity, it is better that it did not exist. And I'm wondering how you interpret this teaching and in what ways it informs your approach to your podcast.
Yeah, I like that quote. That one's a bit of a mic drop there on people. You definitely have to pull that one out when just wait for the reaction. But I think these conversations around religion, it's an extension of these conversations around culture and race, right? Because so often, you're talking about stepping into places where people are speaking a different language, whether a spoken language or a cultural language or a theological language. Even if they're speaking English, and you're speaking English, they're using terms and putting phrases together in different ways depending on the tradition that they're coming from. Right, the same word may have different meaning or carry a different weight depending on where you are. The idea of vocation or the idea of pilgrimage, what it means to take a pilgrimage. The idea of being called to serve, what does that mean? The divine, what does the divine mean? All these things are loaded with different meaning depending on the communities that you're in, and so we need to be literate in that religious language and understand the references and so forth, just in the same way that we would if we were moving into a different cultural space, and understand how different imagery or different literary references or ways of talking about the natural world or the spiritual world are different depending on those communities that we work in. So, I think that that's something that I've acknowledged. I come from an interfaith family, and I've seen how that dynamic works out on a personal level, both when there's been some effort to bridge divides and when those efforts have been undermined by prejudice or just not being aware of those having that cultural competency to understand those differences. So, it's something that is really, it feels like a life's work for me, really, that I feel called to help be a bridge builder between people of different religious traditions, and frankly, that in this day and age includes people who don't necessarily fit into a neat and tidy box, right? Because so many of us are working through these issues of what it is, what do we believe, and how do we relate to our neighbors and the universe around us, and what's our purpose here, right? We're all asking these questions. And for some of us, the answers come a little bit easier depending on the formation that we've had in our family upbringing. And for others of us, we're still questioning.
So interesting, because in the first question you talked a bit about your family background, and
right.
We're moving into the kind of bridge building across cultural divides, right? And now we're moving into this notion of building bridges across like religious divides as well. And I'm interested, a few of the qualities that I recognize in your responses that seem to me are essential to the work that you do. One seems to be patience and understanding, right? But I'm also thinking about, this idea of courage as well. I think so often what gets in the way of, us stepping out of our comfort zone is, fear of being in spaces that we're not familiar with. So I'm wondering, for you, what role does that courage, that notion of consciously, deliberately putting oneself in those spaces play in that work of building bridges across lines?
Yeah, well, it's something that I am conscientious of, particularly as somebody that also travels often with a camera, right? Be it a video camera or a still camera, right? Because oftentimes I'm stepping into spaces where it is clearly evident before I even open my mouth that I am not from there, right? And in addition to the cultural boundaries that are potentially between us, I'm including another one by sticking this big mechanical object between me and the person that I'm having a conversation with or trying to talk to. We're not even necessarily looking at each other eye to eye in some cases. So it comes part and parcel with being somebody who is interviewing people, who's talking to people, who's taking their picture, who's trying to tell a story about them, to, reduce those barriers as much as possible, just in sort of the energy that we're putting out there. And that's something that, I think it's something that I find that I always have to work on, and I have to be aware of how I'm presenting myself. And then at some point, I just have to like let it all fall away. Because if I'm going the opposite and I'm thinking about it all the time, then I'm not being present and actually relating to this person as a human being, right? And if we're just human beings, if all of the cultural baggage and the histories that we may or may not be projecting on the other person are so present in their mind, then it's sort of cutting out the actual interaction that we're having when you and I talk, right? When we have a genuine interaction, we can feel, and we know this through just having those experiences of talking with somebody who maybe doesn't speak the language well, right? Or we don't speak their language well, and we're trying to have a dialogue with them. And sometimes you can totally connect with the person just by holding their hand, right? Or looking them in the eye. So I think that those are techniques that some of us are born with. Some of us just have that as a gift that they can connect with people, and others of us have to cultivate. And I think, for myself, I do feel like like I was saying before, I was brought up in a family that I feel was fairly welcoming and had open doors to people. If people needed a place to stay, they were welcome in our home, and that was sort of part of what my upbringing was about. But it was also a place where I had these extended periods of time living, sometimes even sharing the same room with somebody who came from a whole different country. And so I got to experience what that person was like up close. And so I don't necessarily come with that same fear that you're talking about, that some people get hung up on. But it's still, it still is something very different, because we can get comfortable to our own way of living. And when we're thrown into a situation where we are the only person of a different background, whatever it is, whether it's religious or racial, cultural, language wise, whatever, we do act a little bit differently. And I think one of the things that I'm striving for continually in my work and in my personal life is how do I shed as many of those preconceived notions or things that, again, I'm sort of projecting on the situation as opposed to just being there.
I think of, if I'm being honest about my own self and how I move in spaces where I'm either the only one or one of just a handful of people of African descent, Black or brown folk. And being honest, I don't always feel this way, but there are times that I feel a kind of sense of kind of tangible unease,
Sure.
kind of like And being real with myself about that anxiety, that, where that comes from, this kind of constant vigilance, that can be part of your being as you move through space. So it's just really interesting, and being conscious of that and then actively working to begin to reduce that and shed that. But that requires a certain amount of safety, right? The reality of safe spaces, and then experiencing enough of those safe spaces that it begins to become kind of part of you, So I find it to be oftentimes that's a goal that I have, but I also find it to be challenging sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like I have these conversations so frequently, in part because my wife is Black and she moves through the world very differently than I do. And I mean, even though it's hard to hear, sometimes those conversations are about even being in spaces with my own family. We go to a family gathering and I experience that family gathering very differently than she does. And it's, it's hard to hear. It's hard to hear that sometimes when, there can be things that are said or even not said, that is just a feeling in the room where I'm experiencing it as, either, well, that's, they're an older person. They're sort of set in their ways. Like, don't think too deeply about it. It wasn't necessarily about you. It was just, it's sort of, things come and they just sort of pass me by, right? Because I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to keep it moving, right? People that I know unconditionally love me because I'm a member of the family and we've grown up together, and I don't really think too deeply about how it is that they're acting in any sort of given moment, whether warmly or coolly, and interacting with me, right? So, sometimes we've got something going on and they're really loving and effusive, and other times they seem a little distracted and they've got something else going on and with their life, and so we're not necessarily having that deep of a connection at that particular occasion. But I know that there's going to be another occasion, a few months from now or whatever, if we're having a big family gathering, I'm going to see him again. So it's no big deal. It's been happening for my entire life. But my wife, who is relatively new to the family, is coming into this family dynamic as an adult with her life experience, experiences those things very differently. And sometimes it can just be a very small thing that can sort of set off, change the energy around a whole weekend for her, if we're together for a family holiday or a gathering or something. And when we get back and or we're on the ride home from the get together and we're having that conversation. Wow, that was, how'd you like that? That was fun, right? We had a good time. And she's like, well, actually, so-and-so said something and I just didn't really feel welcome the rest of the time that I was there. I kept thinking about it, or anytime I interacted with them, I thought about that. And so it's all to say that I check myself now on those things, because I realize that even as close to our home dynamic, we experience things very differently. And so my antenna is up a little bit more. My awareness is, I strive to be more aware of those things, such that not only am I going to have a good time and I'm going to be safe and feel okay, but my wife and by extension our daughter, who moves through this world as a brown person, is also going to experience it. I can't make it the same, but I'm her partner, I'm her father, and I have a responsibility to keep my family safe.
It's always interesting to me as a Baha'i, right? And this principle of the oneness of mankind being the core principle of the faith, right? And internalizing that, understanding it, working towards it, internalizing that as a spiritual reality, yes? Right. But then at the same time, moving in a world that works to undermine that, and there being real sociological implications, right? Yeah. On your psyche, on your body, as a result of being part of a marginalized group. So there's a tension. What I'm saying is that there are times that I experience a kind of tension there between holding that reality, right, in the physical world as I move through space, but then this spiritual reality, right? And the spiritual being our essential identity beyond culture, beyond pigmentation. That's our essential identity. But then carrying that and then moving through the physical world and being aware about how that also, there's a certain level of awareness I have to have as I move through those spaces, in terms of preserving myself, protecting those that I care about and I love, and, just functioning. So it's a really interesting, I find that point of tension to be a really interesting space.
Yeah. No, I mean, spirituality and faith is all well and good until you put down the prayer book and step out into the real world, right? So
exactly.
it's I think that's the test start right from that first step out the door. You are experiencing, depending on where it is that you're living, people who have radically different worldviews than yourself. I certainly experienced that, in DC. We have a beautiful diversity and just a thriving mix of people, even in our own neighborhood, which is wonderful. I mean, I could just sit on the sidewalk outside our building and have conversations with people walking by all day long about any of this stuff if they wanted to stop and talk to me about it, So, and I think, the religion part of it and what we believe is real too. It's who are we opening ourselves up to interact with? Who do we let in? Who do we want to have those conversations with? Because, all these things intersect with race and culture and everything. And religion is a big part of that equation too. Right. And if you said to somebody, okay, you're a Christian, for example, and you believe, that we were all created in the image of God. Okay, boom. Here's some Muslim friends that we're putting in your life. What do you have to say to those folks? Do you give them the time of day, or are you dismissive of them? Maybe you've already gotten over, Jews. Oh, Jews, they're okay. If they just accepted Christ, they'd be cool, right? But they're people of the book. We're good with them. Oh, but then these Muslims come along, and you're like, well, how do you engage with that, right? What have you been taught about who Muslims are, and how are you going to be engaging with them? Or how about these Mormons? These guys are Christians too, right? But then they've got this other guy that they're also following that wrote some other book. Are they still Christians in their eyes? Do you still take them, to be your brothers and sisters, or have they gone astray, right? What if you throw in somebody who's an atheist? This person straight up just doesn't believe in God, right? That's a test for some people that they can't engage with it. Actually, and push it a little bit further. This past week, we had some conversations with some Satanists. They just straight up believe in the devil. They believe that their definition of what the devil is, it's a diverse group. Each of us have tests on that dynamic. And one of the little games I like to play with my interfaith friends is, where's your line? Where can't you cross? Is it with people of your group that believe a little bit differently than you? What about those people that, might believe from your perspective that there's more than one God? What if they believe in what you perceive to be a different God? What if they believe in the Antichrist, of what it is that you're following, So for each of us, I think that there are different tests. And in a pluralistic society, if that's sort of our ideal, I think our challenge is to be open to not stand in judgment of other people, but to really listen. And one of the things I like that Baha'u'llah says is that we should consort with the followers of all religions in the spirit of friendliness and fellowship. That if you're being a true friend, you would take the time to listen. Doesn't mean you have to agree all the time. In fact, most of the time you probably won't.
Yeah, it makes me think that, it's so easy to talk about the idea of oneness and unity, but really we don't know where we stand until we're tested. Until we're confronted with a situation or an individual. It could be somebody of a different faith. It could be, I don't know, maybe, your son or your daughter wants to marry somebody outside of their cultural group of origin. whatever, and that can be a big one. That's a big one for some people. Somebody outside of your family's economic, class,
Yeah.
Be they poor or richer or whatever. And it's then that we really get a sense of where we are. Jack, you're a white male of Jewish descent who embraced the Baha'i faith, and you are in 2003. And one of the most profound teachings in the Baha'i faith in regards to the issue of race is the respective roles that each group has to play in bringing about the eradication of the disease of racism. And the Baha'i writings clearly articulate that both blacks and whites bear a distinct but shared responsibility in solving this most intractable of problems. Shoghi Effendi, who's one of the central figures of the faith, has stated, quote, "Let the whites make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards the member of the other race, to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions, and to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who have received for so long such grievous and slow healing wounds." And I'm wondering how you understand this statement.
Like I said earlier, the first two people that I see most mornings are my wife and daughter. So the first two people that I'm seeing are black women. And I mean, frankly, if I want to have a happy household, I better be thinking about these things.
So that's a universal law.
Foremost in my mind. No, but it's true. It's very true. I think it's been a real whatever. When you marry anybody, your world changes, and chances are your worldview changes if you're taking into account anything that this other person has to say. If you're a man marrying a woman, you get some new understanding of what it's like to be a woman moving through this world. If you're a white man marrying a black woman, you get a real education. And because, I mean, our life experiences are quite different. So I have to be thinking about the well-being of black women as a central priority to my life. If I wasn't thinking about it before in a real lived way, I certainly am now. And, I remember speaking with a group. I was in Egypt, and I was part of a group that was talking with some folks who were in sort of academia and government and things. And one of these folks that we were talking to, they shared that that they had spent some time living in, I think it was in Northern Virginia, and that they really thought they sort of had this very perfect picture of DC, and it was a beautiful space. And I said, look, I know it's a little bit hard to imagine. I fear for my daughter's life every day, because you can't turn on the news and not see that black and brown people are under attack. And so and my daughter is part of that, so I have to make it a priority in my life to see what's being talked about in that quote by Shoghi Effendi as being vitally important for my own self-interest, right? That on an immediate level, if I want my family to thrive and survive, it's integrally connected to the liberation and self-determination of black people, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And, by extension, I think that, you can connect that across groups, right? Like I think about the Baha'i community, and we've got this travel ban that's going on in the U.S. right now. You think that doesn't connect to the Baha'i community? You think that just because people are targeting Muslims, that the Baha'i community, which has its origins in Iran, that has a bunch of people running around with Muslim sounding names, that they're not getting it, like the Sikh community is getting it, Indians who wear beards and turbans for the men. The Baha'i community, I think, is on that list. We sometimes just don't realize it, or certain sections of our own community may not even realize it, because we say, oh, well, we're for the oneness of humanity. We're so small, you know, the Baha'i community is so small. We're not even on people's radar. We might be on people's radar, just the wrong kind, because they got folks confused for something else. So, you know, I think thankfully, when I read some of the letters from the Baha'i institutions that have talked about the issues of race, and certainly in this present day and age that we're experiencing, I'm encouraged by the language that they use, the interconnectivity that they acknowledge with regard seeing issues directly concerning the Baha'i community also being related to, just caught up in making sure that as others thrive, the Baha'i community will thrive too. And that we shouldn't just be looking out for ourselves, because we are everybody. I mean, our community is arguably, I think, the most, on an international level, the most diverse in terms of being populated by people of practically every nation and tribe in the world, right? So it's a beautiful thing that we've built, and it's wonderful that we're very embracing as a community and have a mandate towards racial unity by our founder, which is something that not necessarily all present day religious communities have, or at least the way that they're practiced. You know, they have to sort of go back and retrofit. I mean, it's funny to think about, right? People have to go back to the message of Jesus and say, okay, Jesus actually was saying this on a fundamental level, but, you know, after thousands of years, folks have been sort of caught up in other stuff. And so the way that their church is practiced, they have to figure out a way to create racial reconciliation. Whereas I think in the Baha'i community, it's right there. It's right there in the text over and over again. And so there's no escaping it. We can't hide behind anything. There's nothing to blind ourselves to this being a priority. And our institutions remind us of that over and over again, which I'm grateful for. But at the same time, I think that, because Baha'is tend to be apolitical, right, are not caught up in partisan politics, because those politics bleed into every social issue, especially nowadays. And it's hard to find those separating lines between, is this a political statement or simply a humanitarian statement? I think, unfortunately, and I find myself, you know, liable of this as well, that we can sort of say, well, you know, I'm not going to get involved with that necessarily, because it's too much on the politics side of things. Whereas I think that, you know, as we're seeing, Baha'is are being encouraged to be more involved in discourses of society, and find that right balance in each of our individual lives to do that. So I think that we should be more bold in stepping out there and saying, finding the right thing, you know, the right situation, the right type of action that's appropriate for us in our family situation. But we do say, you know, that our essential humanity is tied up in the humanity of others, whether or not they believe Baha'u'llah is a manifestation of God, a messenger of God, whether or not they share the same, you know, language and skin type and, you know, what other characteristics we want to have, just fundamentally on a level, human level. If somebody's coming for somebody else, they're coming for us, or, you know, they're coming for us next at the very least. So you might as well, look out for them first.
Well, Jack, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I wanted to ask you about hope, and I wanted to ask you what propels you forward as you're, engaging in this work, and what inspires you to continue.
Yeah, well, I think that we are in a dark period right now, but we have the potential to get to a better place. The answers are there if we want to see them. It's not even really about finding them, right? It's about recognizing them, about seeing connection that exists between us, about seeing that we can make choices to ensure a more fruitful and prosperous life for both ourselves and others. I think it's part of, sometimes when I think about as a relatively new father, thinking about the type of life lessons that we pass on to our daughter, my wife and I, when we think about choices, it's not so much about a parental figure, which, if you think about it, for all intents and purposes, might as well be a dictator, or, in the eyes of a child, like an all-powerful deity, right? Like we basically have the same power over a child, right? It's not about us as the ones in power, either we're lifting the person up or crushing them, right? It's about empowering this young being to make informed choices and understand the consequences of those choices. And as humanity, we've been given free will, right? We've been created by an all-powerful creator, a loving creator that has given us free will. And it's up to us to understand what the choices are in front of us and what the consequences are of those choices. And, in a lot of instances we make mistakes, but, who amongst us on an individual level doesn't have a life filled with mistakes? We all do. We make mistakes every day. It's just the middle of the afternoon. I've probably made 24 already today. So,
I made one back in 75, I think.
Well, you're a better man than I am. What can I say? Some of us got it, some of us don't. I think that's kind of the essence of it, is the hope is about looking at each other, feeling a real genuine interest and connection to one another, and being patient with both ourselves and each other, forgiving of ourselves when we make mistakes, and proving through our action that we're deserving of the forgiveness of other people. Right. I think that kind of connects back to that quote that you were sharing about Shoghi Effendi too, that frankly, I think a lot of white people don't get, is that we say that we're woke, or we say that well, that's not me. I'm not a colonizer. My family didn't own slaves. What do you want? What do you want from me? Right. Or I said the right thing. I showed up to the rally. Right. And then we get called on some ignorant nonsense that just came out of our mouths. And the first place that we go to is some sort of defensive position. Right. Like I was right up until now, as if we were sort of forgetting of all the other stuff that we had to learn along the way to even get to this place. So, I think when part of that dynamic of some people, of folks who have felt, disrespected, we're finally at this point in history where people can speak up and have agency without there being severe repercussions immediately, like death. How about death, right? How about being separated from your family immediately for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
That type of level of repercussion. And we're still not free of that, right? Because people are getting shot in the middle of the street, in the middle of broad daylight, for absolutely no reason. So it's not that we're so far removed from these things. And the fact that people can even even speak with some amount of self-confidence and assurance that they're not going to face that type of retribution, that they can speak, folks can speak for themselves as equals. It's great that we've been able to get to this place, because for most of our history we haven't. What it also means is that we're at sort of a bit of a tender, awkward place where folks are just realizing their voice, right? The power of their voice. We have platforms to augment the voices of individuals, which can be a beautiful thing, can be a dangerous thing. And on the other side, folks that are hearing these voices for the first time, are not used to it and have not been spoken to in this way, and suddenly think that it's a new thing, and people are sort of speaking out of turn. And so I think, we're going to be in this clash place for a little while, but the more that we can keep our level head about it, I think, our children's generation and our children's generation are going to be able to find a more peaceful dynamic, because for them, they're going to have grown up with these things being very, very natural and commonplace. And so they're going to be much, much more able to navigate these spaces than you and I or our parents have ever been able to do so. So, obviously the hope lies in the next generation. And it's just our responsibility to safely guide them to that place and not blow up the world in the process.
A really good point to end on. That's wonderful.
That's what we're just striving for. We're striving to avoid complete and
annihilation. Complete annihilation.
Yeah. But
thank you so much, Jack. This has been really wonderful, man. I just really appreciate who you are as a person, the work that you're doing, the consciousness, the intention, the awareness, and the humility with which you're doing that work. So thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thanks.
You've been listening to America's Most Challenging Issue. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. And remember, unity and diversity is at once a vision for the future and a principle to guide the world community in its response to these challenges. Not only must this principle come to animate relations among the nations of the planet, but it must also be applied within both local and national communities. If they are to prosper and endure, the unifying salutary effects of applying this principle to the redesign and development of communities the world over would be incalculable, while the consequences of failing to respond appropriately to the challenges of an ever-contracting world will surely prove disastrous. From the Baha'i Writings, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.